announce at the outset that we have consulted the best minds on the Science and High Tech Committee and have discovered that the bright object in the sky is definitely the sun. They've assured me that there's nothing to worry about. Give it a day or two and it'll go away. So enjoy it while you can. I'd like to have you join with me in welcoming two new City Club members that are in the audience today. Ask them to stand and hold your applause until we've introduced both. The first is Cindy Bolke, who is a recruiter with Robert William James and Associates. And the second is Christine Tomlinson, Executive Director, Oregon Child Care Initiative. Welcome to the City Club of Portland. We have some exciting programs coming up that I will mention quickly here. First, Tuesday, June 19th, we have an open forum. It is entitled Rural Land Use Critical Decisions for Oregon's Legislature. It is sponsored by our Land Use and Transportation Standing Committee, and it will feature Hector McPherson, who is a Linn County farmer, former legislator, and one of the chief authors of our land use laws here in Oregon. Tom Troop, who is Deschutes County Commissioner and Land Conservation and Development Commission member, also a former member of the legislature, and Frank Nims, President of Oregonians in Action. That open forum will take place noon to 1:30 in the Multnomah County Library. It is free and open to the public, as are all our open forums. On Wednesday, June 20th, we will also have an open forum which is entitled The Governor's Commission Report Statewide Faculty Reaction. It is planned by the Education Standing Committee and will feature Dr. Wayne Wessling, who is the Faculty Senate Chairman at the University of Oregon, Dr. Pam Hellings, who is Faculty Senate Chairman at Oregon Health Sciences University, and Dr. Mike Martin, Faculty Senate Chairman at Oregon State University, and Dr. John Cooper, Faculty Senate Chairman at Portland State University. That meeting will take place from noon to 1:30 in the U.S. Bancorp Tower on the 26th floor, and yours truly, who is not a doctor, will be chairing that session. Next Friday, we have a real exciting program, and it's unusual in that it will be a very visual program, so while I would urge those of you that normally listen on the radio and those in the radio audience today that if you can come, please do so. It will be Mick Scott, Chairman of the American Advertising Museum, and he will present a nostalgic review of America's ads and the businesses which created them in a talk entitled From Barber Poles to Bernbach, The Saga of American Advertising, and that will be here next Friday in the Benson Hotel Mayfair Room. And on Friday, June 29th, John Frohnmeyer will escape from Washington, D.C. briefly. He is chair of the, and I didn't write this, folks, recently controversial National Endowment for the Arts. John has also maintained his City Club membership, perhaps in anticipation of the day that he can get out of Washington, D.C. on a more permanent basis. In your program, you may have noticed that on July 13th we have Elizabeth Dole, who is going to be our speaker at the Hilton Hotel. If you wish to come to that, I would urge you to pre-register, and there is a form in your book, in your bulletin, whatever it's called, to get tickets, and we expect a full crowd for that, so I would urge you as City Club members to get your reservation in early. On to today's program. Our board host today, seated at my far left, who is Pete Baer, Treasurer of the City Club and member of the Board of Governors. He is a loan officer with National Mortgage Company and has just recently returned from his honeymoon, following in the grand tradition of board members getting married this year. Welcome back, Pete. And he will have the privilege of asking the first question. In our new old tradition, Diana Smiley, who is a member of the Education Standing Commission, has the honor of asking the second question from the floor. And as usual, City Club members only may ask questions. If you have a written question, there is a form on your table. Please hold it up so the staff can bring it forward. If you have an oral question, there will be a mic in the center of the room. And as always, City Club member questions end in a question mark. Thank God we always get a few new people that like that line I've been using for a year. Discussions and predictions relating to the relationship of Oregon and what sometimes may seem ephemeral, the Pacific Rim, has been waxing and waning in the public sector. Often you will see information that says that Oregon will be the center of the Pacific Rim economic boom that will occur in the future. Our strategic location is often touted as being a key to our success in dealing with Pacific Rim countries. There was a book some time ago that defined a new country called Ecotopia. The City Club of Portland defined a new county called Willamette. And our speaker today has now defined a new state called Cascadia. A combination of Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. Our speaker today will propose that this combination would give a dynamite opportunity economically and culturally to deal with the opportunities that will arise on the Pacific Rim. David Brewster is our speaker today, and he has been talking about this idea fairly recently in Seattle and has come to test it out down here in Portland. He discussed it in his new quarterly journal called The New Pacific, a journal that was recently founded by Brewster. David Brewster is a former journalist. He founded the Seattle Weekly in 1976. He says in his biography, after visiting Portland and reading Willamette Week. He may be best known as editor of a publication that I have used frequently called Northwest Best Places, and has recently published a new guidebook for Portland called Portland Best Places. When asked if the City Club was included in a best place in Portland, his answer was no. We'll never invite him back again, but we have to have a speaker today. He will discuss his unique approach to the Pacific Rim and his unique idea of forming a megastate called Cascadia in a speech entitled The New Pacific Era. Help me welcome Mr. David Brewster.
It's an honor to address this famous organization. As I'm sure many of you know, Seattle borrowed the idea of a city club about 8 years ago, emulating this organization, which I had learned today is 73 years old. It seemed to me pretty young for Portland. And I am struck by the large number of members you have in comparison with what Seattle has been able to do. I've borrowed lots of ideas from Portland. I was first down here working on the Best Places Northwest Guidebook in 1975, researching restaurants in Portland for the book. L'Omelette was the leading restaurant in that time. Some of you may remember that place. And was hanging out at Willamette Week. They provided me a desk, and that's where the idea of doing a weekly paper, such as Seattle Weekly, came from. The notion of borrowing good ideas among these three cities, including Vancouver, has thus made me a lot of money, given me a career. I'm still a journalist, actually, not a former journalist, and still publishing Seattle Weekly. But the idea of thinking in terms of the three states, which I first formed together somewhat arbitrarily into the guidebook, and then in traveling about and discovering all of these places and creating a kind of information network for restaurants and lodgings. And of course, in our new edition, there'll be a special section on city clubs. The city club in Seattle is not in Seattle Best Places either. I know you're all feeling very slighted. I have, and about a dozen other individuals, friends of mine in Seattle, started to come up with the notion of thinking of other ways in which these states and cities can share and can become more than they would be separately through a series of informal and perhaps formal networks to create a semblance of a new state, a larger state. So I'd ask you today to try to imagine that you're living in this state of the New Pacific, or of Cascadia, a country of 529,000 square miles, which is 3 times the landmass of California and larger than the 12 countries which compose the European community, a population in excess of 10 million, and with a population of 5 million in the urban area, the urban I-5 corridor between Vancouver and Portland. A megastate with a large base of the economy and of population and of resources, and yet with cities of a livable size. Through certain of the advantages of our history is we have dispersed cities rather than a single large dominant city. In Puget Sound, this happened because of the need to locate cities near where timber was and build a sawmill there rather than one that could concentrate that, and it's one of the advantages we have of dispersing the growth throughout Puget Sound. And the same causes have given us this benefit of 3 cities of approximately the same size, of very much the same economic base, and of very close, though different in interesting ways, political traditions, so that these cities can borrow a great deal and fertilize one another with good ideas, warn about bad ideas, and be able to share the base of population and of wealth. In a sense, what the discovery of this new country is a rediscovery of an old country. Clearly, the boundaries that one is talking about here are the boundaries that was originally put together by the Hudson Bay Company or the Northwest Company, trapping fur-gathering boundaries, or the boundaries of the original Oregon Territory, extending up to 5440, halfway up British Columbia, and over to the Continental Divide. The area is tied together by common political traditions. It once was a shared dual sovereignty nation, as Britain and America could not quite decide how to, where to put the line, and so both countries ruled the area politically. And it is an area that obviously has much in common in its economy, export-oriented region, high-tech, as well as natural resources, and an area that is blessed with scenery and with a people that know how to preserve that scenery. The thinking in those terms involves a sort of paradigm shift about the way in which we think of the future of our individual states and cities. Putting together the 3 states, one can create a megastate which in its wealth and in population can hold its own much more equally against the megastate of California. It is a state which, like many regions in the world, has a tiger economy. I feel this particularly in Seattle, which is going through probably too rapid growth, but is certainly a supercharged economy, and likely to stay that way for quite a few more years. The same is true in Vancouver, particularly as it becomes the new Hong Kong, and I think is really increasingly true in this region as well. One sees throughout the world a dispersal of power. If you look at the dissolving of the Soviet Empire, that would be one example of that. The way in which countries are pulling themselves free from centralized direction, and in some cases free from misdirection. And as they're forming into new economic entities, which are more in keeping with the global economy and the borderless world that has been created by that economy. So I think this region, without seceding from the Union, obviously, can think of itself, on the one hand, as part of a unified economic order. Putting enough of us together also, I think, can break us out of a pattern which we're all guilty of, and that is being sort of proud of our backwaterness. There are all sorts of reasons for us to be pleased with smallness and with proper scale. And Seattle shares that view just as much as Portland does, just as much as Vancouver does. And I think by the dispersal of these major cities, we can still have that advantage. But I would also feel that it is time that we realize that we're really a front-water economy and a front-water civilization. And the kinds of things we can put together with a large enough base, and particularly a large enough intellectual base, put us to the forefront of the global economy, rather than being a colonial appendage of larger states such as California or the United States, or even of overseas investment. The way to control our destiny is to be large enough to have the institutions which will control that destiny. Some of you are probably aware of the intellectual foundations of that kind of thinking, what is called the borderless world, by Kenichi Omai, who is based in Tokyo, and has written about how the future of the economy lies not, the global economy lies not with nations, but with cities and regions. He draws a lot from the thinking of Jane Jacobs about what motivates, what produces growth. It's cities. Cities forming regions. It's not states. Conservative resistance to states obviously feeds into this, as well as a lot of urban idealism about the role of cities. Cross-border alliances in business practices, cross-country alliances as a way of penetrating markets or a way of sharing information in the high-velocity world that we live in is another way in which this crossing of borders is an essential understanding if we are going to be a front-water economy. Omai gives an example of a city, Sapporo in Japan, that has suffered because of Japanese policy. Sapporo could be one of the leading cities of Japan if it could get out from under the state control which holds it back. It could have air routes. It's closer, of course, to the US than other Japanese cities, major air routes, but it's denied those. It could be shifted in time to where it could open a stock market 3 hours earlier than the Tokyo stock market and probably become the dominant Asian stock market. All of these things are denied by the state, which keeps the large cities in Tokyo and Osaka. And Omai goes on to say that what will enable China to grow is that if it could create 10 Singapores. The engines of growth are cities like Singapore, not states like China. And if it can be separated into manageable sizes and then unleashed, then China can become a tiger economy of its own. Likewise, if one looks at America, the real competition in America is not America versus Japan. It is more to be put as North Carolina versus Boston. These are two regions competing for Japanese investment, competing for world position. And we need to understand that the American national economy is really a series of smaller economies, and those which have enough integrity, enough scope, and enough resources, which we as individual states do not, will be the ones who win in this battle. Where, in a sense, are the 10 Singapores of America? Now, I'd like to tell you some of the things which are happening to this region along these lines, and then also to sketch out a few things which might happen. First of all, there is an increasing interest in forming, at least for purposes of discussion and possibly sharing of information, organizations which unite this region. The Legislative Leadership Forum, consisting of 60 representatives from legislators of a wide region, all the way to Alberta, and including Montana and Idaho and Alaska, in addition to the 3 states we're talking about, has been exploring creation of a technology center, sharing of creation of a capital investment pool, a telenetwork to link scholars, as well as waste compacts to negotiate the shipment of garbage and other waste between states. Seattle recently held a leadership conference in Vancouver and it was a kind of a love-in between those two cities. Seattle is fascinated by Vancouver, and Vancouver, through the Free Trade Act, is fascinated by the West Coast, looking more down the coast than back across the country to its old ties to Toronto. The Can-Am Corridor, as it's called, the Canadian-American Corridor, I-5 in the Whatcom County and so on, is one of the fastest growing areas in the country now, with a lot of Canadian shopping as well as investment and a lot of American interest in that area. There's a thing called the Pacific Northwest Economic Partnership, which is created out of the Free Trade Act and out of this interest primarily between Vancouver and Seattle for joint marketing of products as well as working out certain regulatory differences, say, in agricultural matters. Likewise, between Canada or Vancouver, British Columbia, and Washington State is the promotion of the idea of the two-nation vacation. That is, tourism thought of as combining the attractions of the two areas, since left by themselves, it might be, you might find yourself a little bored on the fourth day in a city like Seattle. If you didn't have my book, that is. I would like to say that as we go about pushing the idea of this new consciousness, is that the reaction in Vancouver is much more positive than the reaction that we have had in Portland. And I deplore this. I think that the much more logical alliance is between Seattle and Portland, or between Washington and Oregon. But the Seattle power establishment, for whatever reason, seems to be going from a kind of a tired marriage with Portland to the pursuit of a trophy wife in Vancouver. The attraction, obviously, is the enormous inflow of investment from Hong Kong and Asia into a British culture on the Pacific in Vancouver. It's flowing primarily to Los Angeles and to Vancouver. And Seattle law firms and other institutions are eager to get in early in that connection. And I mention this because it seems to me that Portland, those of you who find this interesting to be a part of this new Congress, this new common market, need to keep in mind that in many Seattle eyes, the thought is that Portland would rather go it alone and would rather not be a part of this, and is suspicious of the motives of a city like Seattle or of Vancouver in doing that. You have a lot of, we all should be suspicious of the motives of that, and Seattle is obviously poised between the two states in a crossroads position to benefit more by this. That's all the more reason in my mind why, if this were to be jointly promoted, and particularly from people in Portland or Vancouver who are on the perimeter, it would have a lot more validity. Now, here are a few ideas in the future. One is to create high-speed rail between Vancouver and Seattle and Portland and on down to Eugene. The Port of Seattle is in the forefront of looking at either magnetic levitation trains or high-speed French-style bullet trains up to 300 miles an hour. This would, first of all, solve one of the problems that the Port of Seattle has, and that is the overcrowded airport, by allowing a new runway to be built in Bellingham or in Vancouver, and by a 45-minute connection for both cargo and for passengers, be able to solve airport overcrowding. But it's obviously, these cities, for them to be thought of as a union in some way, have got to be closer together. And a high-speed rail, which is being looked at by various cities, various regions in the country, some of the other 9 Singapores here, is something which is being very aggressively pursued between Vancouver and Seattle. And I would invite those of you who are interested in this is to see that Portland is well represented in this. There's thought of a common primary in 1992, a 4-state primary. There is talk of a sharing of the arts two of the ideas which came out of the Vancouver-Seattle Conference, Leadership Conference, were the creation of a Vancouver-Seattle Regional Summer Arts Festival in alternating cities in alternating years, and also a three-city, including Portland, invitational visual arts festival that would shift among the three cities. In the summer, this is an area obviously of great attraction for international arts festivals. The Goodwill Arts Festival, which is coming up, is the most current example in Seattle. It is a city which lies in the north, where people want to go in the summer, and which has a very extraordinary flourishing of the arts. But the arts, in my judgment, are too small for these individual cities for them truly to flourish. And there are certain art forms, such as chamber opera, which none of the cities is doing, but a city of 5 million, if you think of the three together, obviously could support. There is talk about the creation of regional councils to coordinate questions of water and energy, modeled on the Pacific Northwest Power Planning Council. There is talk of a common educational market that might involve allowing anyone who lives in the three states to attend at a favored tuition basis any of the colleges, public universities in the three states. And furthermore, to begin to arrange the universities into a hierarchy, such as the California system has done, so that there is a major research university, a major agricultural university, a major law school, more so than if we triplicate these institutions. There would still be law schools, but there would be an arrangement of hierarchy, so that some at the top would be truly distinguished national institutions. If you look at public universities, state-supported universities, the great ones are in larger states. I think we feel in Washington, as I'm sure you feel here, is that somehow we can overcome that with a smaller state and still have a Berkeley. I think it's impossible. I think that the creation of common educational opportunities, high school as well, a school of performing arts that would be open throughout the three states. Many things become possible when you move yourself into the state of Cascadia and realize the tax base, the talent base, the resource base that you have. I would hope that our natural anxieties through rivalry between these three cities would continue, and that the cities would continue to think of themselves as separate and different, having their own accents, having their own styles, but that it is not a contradiction also to be thinking of all that we have in common. We have much more in common than we have that differs, and that as we would start to create certain institutions, one is the journal which I helped to create called The New Pacific, which is meant to be the voice, so far as we know, the only publication that takes these three states as its goal, the voice of the best thinking in these three states in culture, politics, and economics, equally divided among the writers among the three states. But we are just beginning to create the institutions of a European Parliament, if you will. Now, I'd end with the story that Will Glasgow in your town told me. Will was interested in the possibility, when the Mariners were undergoing all sorts of problems, of sharing a baseball team, Major League Baseball team, between the two cities. This was Bruce Engel's idea, which Will was representing. And it would be that they would play in the Kingdome during the rainy period in the spring, and then they would play down here in your wonderful outdoor stadium in June, July, August, or half of June and July and August. I guess probably don't want to take too many chances in June. And then back to the Kingdome for the fall. Seemed to me a wonderful idea. It got absolutely nowhere, and Will was telling me that when he presented this idea to the Chamber of Commerce here, they were not interested in it. The idea in Seattle went over like a lead balloon. And he said what was lacking was a forum, a regional forum, a city club of Cascadia, where an idea like this could get a fair hearing, and where the advantages of a much larger, the problem with the Mariners is just too small a base to support a winning baseball team. Leave aside how awful the Kingdome is. And the cities need to, there needs to be a place, in addition to a small journal of this kind, by which these ideas, some very creative solutions by which we can do things which we would otherwise not be able to do, can be aired, and where bad ideas can be rejected and some good ideas can begin to gather some support. So my hope is that gradually we will create 1,000 Friends of Cascadia, the kinds of people who, coming from land preservation values, quality of life values, understanding of the exhilaration of the global economy that this region is more than most parts of the country a part of, and understanding that with a little bit of relationship counseling between these cities, that we can do much more working together than we will ever be able to do separately. Thank you.
The idea of the train, by the way, was not in the speech until this morning when David was forced to drive down because of fog at both Seattle and Portland, so speeches do change. Our first question today will come from our board host, Pete Baer. For those of you who wish to ask an oral question, the mic is in the center of the room. Again, if you have a written question, please hold it up so the staff can bring it forward. Pete.
Thank you, Bill. I assured Bill that I spent all my time on my honeymoon thinking about a question for today. David, you touched briefly on the idea of urban intellectualism. And Oregon, in many ways, is basically divided into two areas, particularly economically and politically. That is, the metropolitan area and the downstate area. I understand that Washington likewise has a similar dichotomy, and that probably British Columbia has that same urban and outer lying area concept. What would be the benefits and the problems for the non-urban areas under the Cascadia proposal?
That's a fine question. Here's an analogy. The 4 northern New England states recently formed a compact to do something about forests, which were being lost to development. The 4 states have agreed to engage in a large purchase of forest land to protect it from development. They are asking the Congress to assist them in this. They also have come up with a creative solution which would give tax benefits to the owner of forest land who would sell that land to a conservation group and pay no taxes on the gain in the value of that land, as opposed to if they sold it to a developer, in which case they would have the tax burden. What to do about the hinterland of Cascadia is an essential part of how it would work. One thing, of course, is to tie the hinterland more into the urban culture by high-speed rail, by telecommunications, other devices, so that institutions which are dispersed, as will be happening more and more, are tied into this whole global network which would be focused in these 3 cities. But the other is that I think, for instance, one of the things that could be a common marketing thrust of this area would be to enter into the world of environmental technology, particularly trying to get into the Eastern European and European market before others think of this. It's a very risky world now. This area has great expertise in that. And if it is itself a laboratory and a demonstration of living well on the land and of preserving forests and other natural resources, I think this is a way in which we can market this area to the world with much higher visibility, and taking a theme from the Japanese of concentrating resources and enabling the organizations, the small organizations which are in environmental sciences, to know what is going on, then be able to project that out into the world. But I certainly feel that while the intellectual core is at the universities as well as the major cities, the mission, the purpose of those ideas, and the mission is to create a balanced urban and rural, natural and artificial civilization. That's always been the hope and of all of these states.
Diana Smiley from the Education Standing Committee, you're on.
Mr. Brewster, this sounds like a good idea, but I'm wondering if you could talk about how we could transcend any national barriers to making it happen, and if you could talk about how overcoming those barriers might affect our national policy both in the U.S. and in Canada.
The barriers, obviously the Canadian barrier with the passage of the Free Trade Act is much less so, and I don't think these barriers really amount to much. I think even if they were going to be put back up, particularly the way the global economy now works through joint ventures or whatever, is that they're really very easy. The only barrier that people in Seattle feel about Canada is the long lines crossing the borders at Blaine. And a little relief was created this week, and just putting more guards there. The theorists like Omai say that we need to realize how little those barriers count anymore. They're more in one's mind and in one's past history than in the reality, certainly, of the economy and certainly of the flow of ideas. We, I think, are seeing in Eastern Europe as to how the idea of democracy, the idea of American culture, all of these things had been flowing very effortlessly despite all of these attempts to block that, and are very much embraced by people that have been waiting just for the opportunity to do that. Now, when you come down to cases, for instance, is it all right for somebody in British Columbia to attend the University of Oregon Law School? And what about people in Oregon who are turned away because there's a brighter student coming from there? That's when it gets interesting. Those are not national barriers. Those are academic, institutional barriers. How I think people are willing to corrode the kind of institutional barriers which are standing in the way of a lot of these solutions, land use solutions, political solutions, if people can be mobilized and see the advantages they would have of this. The arts, when Pacific Northwest Ballet thought about moving to Portland or moving to Minneapolis, as they did, so that dancers have a full season of dancing, it makes a lot, it creates a lot better ballet company if you can have enough work for them. In both cases, they were turned away. It was a disaster in Minneapolis, and the discussions never got very far here. And that's because individual boards are very protective of their investment in their own little organization. And they can't see beyond that to the greater quality which they're going to deliver to people who love ballet. Likewise, the Chamber Music Northwest, my favorite arts organization in Portland, which I love to come down for, ought to tour up to Seattle. We've had to create a smaller, less good imitation of that. And if the two could share musicians and they're out here for a while and then come up there, it would be a lot easier. I've been on the board of the counterpart in Seattle, and I can tell you every time I raised that question in my early days as a citizen of the New Pacific, I was hooted down. It does take, it's not national boundaries, it's psychological boundaries, bureaucratic boundaries, pride of authorship questions that we have to overcome.
Cheryl Warren, member. I can't get off the thought of these boundaries, however, and I would like to know if, since other parts of Canada have in the past and are currently considering secession, is there ever any discussion among the citizens in Vancouver, British Columbia, or other parts of British Columbia about ever leaving Canada and becoming part of our part of the country in a formal sense?
No, I don't think so. And so one thing that I always remind my Seattle friends is that Canadians are suspicious of Americans, and they're suspicious of American cultural hegemony, with very good reason. Canadians they want to be like Wales up against Britain. They want to be a small country against a large country and preserve their cultural difference. I say that's essential. I think the preservation of cultural differences to create a true region is essential if we're going to have any culture. The Oregon difference seems to me to be a very helpful component. One of the things that always bothers me about Washington is that it does not believe that it has a distinct culture against the rest of the country. It believes it wants very much to be like everybody else, only more so, as one author said about the Northwest, Robert Cantwell. The famous Nordstrom look in men's suits was once described to me by one of the Nordstroms as the kind of suit that a gentleman can wear and enter into a meeting anywhere in the country, and no one will say, "Where did you get that suit?"
Well, to go from the sublime to the specific here, in an era of cutbacks in Congress for transportation, as we try and fund a small little light rail extension here in Portland, how would you propose, or do you have any thoughts on funding the idea of a high-speed train between Vancouver and Eugene, or parts in between?
The price tag for a high-speed train between tying together Port Cougar is about $4 billion. And there is not much federal money for something of this kind. Now, some private parties are interested in this project. One would have to see the fine print, of course, in their interest. Burlington Northern is interested in it, particularly because it throws in a lot of airline passengers. In France, when they put the high-speed train between Paris and Lyon, they greatly reduced the number of flights between those cities because the train is actually a much quicker way to go between these small runs. So they would do pretty well. There would be a good flow of income. Here's one idea. Since railroads in Puget Sound particularly, and up the Columbia, take prime waterfront, long ago given to them in order to induce them to come out, if you could shift that track to, say, I-5 or a new corridor, a new transportation corridor, for their regular rail service as well as the high-speed rail service, and thus gain that property and then resell that property as prime waterfront property, you could begin to fund the rail in that device. But ultimately, it's an investment in infrastructure that has to be thought of as paying off in the same way that highways do in the broad economy rather than in a thing which pays for itself. But I think there are some creative suggestions, and certainly in France, where they're building a new one of this kind, and in Germany, where the technology is there, and in Japan, these things very clearly pay off. I think that the tying together of these cities, it's really exciting when you think that we would be 45 minutes apart by this device. I mean, it's exciting not to have to be fogged in at the airport, but it's particularly exciting where those 100 flights a day that are now between Portland and Seattle are deflected into this and greatly increased by that rapid motion. I personally feel that without that, this notion would never get very far. We would never really think of ourselves as being joint partners, residents of a common state. But with that, and now is the time, because there's a great interest in the country in having a pilot project. Pittsburgh is looking at this. Milwaukee is looking at this. And I think that through our congressional clout and through the activity of the ports is that we might be able to nab such a project. I think it would also help a great deal in tying together some outlying places such as Eugene and the University of Oregon into the Portland, in the Portland culture, and making Portland at a crossroads rather than at a terminus of this idea.
Politicians would probably be among the first folks to be a bit opposed in trying to save their area and not give up their territory. Have you found any visionary politicians to support your idea? And feel free to name them if you have. And if not, do we eliminate the political side of this and take on some other aspect in order to get this idea started?
Well, the politicians would all be grandfathered in, of course. And they would continue to do what they're doing. What one is looking for here is really the creation of a broader informal government in the same way that the European market, the European community is being put together. A parliament that begins as a place of discussing and working out some common agreements, and possibly after that something that would have some actual power. Who is the Jean Monnet of this movement? The one politician I can name, who's one that many of you know down here, is Paul Schell. And Paul, who used to be the head of Cornerstone and built the Waterfront Place project, I'm sorry, the River Place project, Waterfront Place in the Seattle version, is now a Port of Seattle commissioner. And he is, with a handful of us, a founder of the New Pacific, and one who is who gave a rip-roaring speech in Vancouver, which produced a lot of the excitement for this, and is busy lining up other political supporters in the King County Council, some in the Vancouver aldermen, and I think there are politicians who feel unthreatened by this and who are very excited about it as a way to solve some of the major problems which they're otherwise not doing. Okay. Go ahead, sir.
Gus Mattersdorf from Lewis and Clark College. Also not in your book and not in your speech this noon even is the Pacific Northwest Regional Economic Conference, which was originally suggested by Professor of Economics at the University of Washington and first staged in Portland in 1967, has taken place annually in cities throughout the Pacific Northwest, every state and the province of British Columbia ever since, and will be celebrating its 25th annual meeting next May 2nd to 4th, right here in Portland at another hotel up the street from here. I'm sorry if I was mistaken. In that case, I have no question mark with the end of this. Thank you.
That's very interesting. Thanks for the information. Yes, sir.
You remember, when the greenhouse effect hits us, may we share your water?
You guys should get our water, and you should get less of our garbage. I think that, yeah, I think there are all kinds of inequalities which are historical or are relations of power and so on, which a broader council, I think, would make people feel a lot better about resource allocation.
Just when I brag about the great minds at City Club, I will ask another written question. This one does have a question mark at the end of it. Won't it take more than just a quarterly publication to advance the concept of Cascadia? And what about a regional council or a regional conference, which you have mentioned? But do you have a focus upon which this group can get started so that it has a direction from the very beginning?
We talk about the spirit of '92. '92 will be the start of the European community. 92 is the bicentennial of a great event in this region, two great events, the discovery of the Columbia and Vancouver's exploration of both Vancouver Island and Puget Sound. And some of us have been talking about how to aim towards 92 in publication of some books which would begin to explore this in more detail, and possibly some kind of continental congress gatherings, some possibly to commemorate some of the places and fields and so forth where early gatherings of citizens in the creation of Washington and Oregon Territory took place. I think there will be a lot happening, as I tried to indicate, between the Vancouver Board of Trade and the Seattle Chamber of Commerce. They're exploring 5 or 6 areas of information sharing and of common marketing and of common solutions to some problems. And I think that at the level of the business community, and particularly the law firms, which really stir a lot of the pot of change in this regard, that there is a great deal that is happening, and will continue to do so in the private sector. In the public sector is the harder one, and particularly I think if the environmental side of our politics can perceive a way in which, by gathering a stronger tax base, by gathering a stronger coalition for preservation of these values, and particularly addressing issues of land use and design, that one can accomplish more than by being fragmented, then I think we can look for some citizen action to go along with the business action. I am actually somewhat apprehensive about how much is going on in the private sector to try to link together these economies that the public knows little about and the public has little say about. The conference in Vancouver was really just a collection of bigwigs from Seattle and Vancouver, with a few, journalists and other underlings hanging around, and not much that would indicate real connection with the grassroots politics of either of those regions. British Columbia has severe problems in forest practices, and one of the ways in which this could be quite interesting would be if the environmental movement in Oregon and Washington, which is miles ahead of the movement in British Columbia, aside from some symbolic activity, were to put pressure on timber companies, and particularly on the regulations in that province, in the light of greenhouse considerations and preservation of forests. These forests are being severely damaged as they're farther from cities and farther from where one can see these clear cuts. And that would be, I think, one of the ways in which a common environmental movement, which obviously, as your question before, knows no boundaries, is very internationalized in its outlook, and must be, if we're going to solve global threats to the environment, could be a real force for change in British Columbia.
Well, to get real specific, do you have any suggestions for how the City Club of Portland could get involved and make some of these changes happen?
Maybe if you thought of some connection with the City Club of Seattle, and there could be a joint committee created by the two clubs to explore this, to hold some roundtables, talk with other people about this notion. And since City Club here has a fine history of producing white papers and publications, the Seattle one does some of that, but nothing to the degree that you do, is that might be a good project. And it might be interesting if the two clubs were to meet in one another's cities once a year, and the theme of that meeting, along with a lot of getting to know one another's counterparts and so on, that the theme of that meeting might be the exploration of what the region holds in common. That would be my first suggestion. I'd be glad to help lobby that idea, which I have not really thought of before now, with my friends at the Seattle City Club.
As a final question, is there some logic to the connections between Seattle and Vancouver that doesn't flow the same way for Seattle to Portland, in that they are in two different countries, and so there's a certain amount of protection that you gain by not having the competition between two communities that are in the same country and in fact perhaps have fewer barriers between them?
The basis of the connection is greed. And the people in Seattle think that there's a lot more money coming into Vancouver than there is down here. And the law firms in particular are desperate to hook up with the large Canadian law firms and to get a piece of that action. There are other things which just come with the opening of markets. For instance, the relaxation of the barrier to wine by the Free Trade Act, which has kept American wine out of British Columbia, where there's a wine industry which has been shielded with disastrous effects on the quality of their wine. Now, a lot of Washington and Oregon wine growers, vineyards, winemakers are penetrating that market. It's a newly open market, and therefore there is a kind of a land rush that is going on, or a market rush that is going on. But the other thing is, psychologically, is that Seattle is very big for its britches these days. It really fancies itself to be a city that is prancing on the world stage. And the fascination with Vancouver as the third largest city in Canada, as a city that has quite a national, that is an international reputation, that we, Seattle, can work in some of the reflected splendor of that city, getting people to travel to Vancouver, which is a major tourist destination, more than Portland, more than Seattle, and then come on down and have some spillover effect of that. The World's Fair in '86, Goodwill Games in '90. There's a lot of similar thinking to that. So Seattle people tend to think Vancouver as that's the way to be. That's what we want to be part of. Rapidly growing, putting up whole new cities. The whole World's Fairground of Vancouver was sold to one individual who wrote out a check for $2 billion to acquire that, Li Ka-shing of Hong Kong, and he plans to build there a new downtown which is equal to the size of the present downtown of Vancouver. That's the kind of boggling, huge investment opportunities that people see in Vancouver, and which Seattle business interests would like to be a part of. And I think you can tell from my tone that I think there's a lot of boom and bust stuff in that Seattle doesn't need more of, and there is a lot of overlooking of the kinds of anxieties towards American businesses and American values that one will run into later on from that. But it's an exciting bit of chemistry, and it is the major thing which is getting going, this borderless feeling, and this sense that take two cities of 500,000 people, put them together, and you've got, well, as people say, when you have your first child, that's one, and when you have your second child, that's 10.
Please join me in thanking David Brewster for a fascinating talk. I will say in conclusion that today is National Sauntering Day, and I hope everyone will take advantage of the sunshine and saunter back to your offices. Thank you very much. We're adjourned.